I was kicked out of school as a teenager because of false rumors spread by my mom. Years later, my mom saw my success and demanded money after she entered. The cafeteria at Lincoln High buzzed with its usual chaos, plastic trays clattering, laughter erupting, sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. Max Carson sat at his usual spot, a table near the back with a clear view of both the lunch line and the exits. He wasn't part of any group, but he wasn't invisible either. People knew him as the smart kid, decent grades, quiet demeanor, and absolutely zero drama. That last part, though, was about to change. "Yo, Carson," his classmate Jake Hollis called out as he passed, tray balanced precariously on one hand. "That essay on Gatsby, I owe you, man. Saved my ass." Max gave him a small nod, a flicker of pride briefly crossing his face. His quiet intellect made him a go-to for classmates needing homework help. That, and the fact he didn't charge like some others did. He didn't need the hassle of side hustles, he already had enough to deal with at home. Home was a battlefield. Diane Carson, Max's mother, had a knack for turning the smallest inconvenience into a catastrophe. Her voice had a sharpness that could cut through walls. "Max, for God's sake, how many times do I have to tell you to vacuum the stairs before you leave for school? You're not going to live under my roof and slack off like your father." She barked one morning, slamming a cereal bowl into the sink. Max gritted his teeth but didn't argue. Diane's moods were like unpredictable storms. It wasn't worth the fight. Instead, he grabbed his backpack and left without a word. Diane wasn't cruel in an obvious way, no physical blows or outright threats, but her passive-aggressive jabs and obsession with appearances cut deeper. She often referred to Max as my little disappointment in front of her friends, always wrapped in a joking tone but delivered with a bite that Max felt in his gut. The rumor began innocently enough, if you could call Diane's loose lips innocent. One Thursday evening, Diane was hosting her book club, sipping rose and gossiping with her friends, a group of women as catty as they were well-dressed. "I don't know what to do with him," Diane sighed dramatically, twirling her glass. "I found something in Max's room last week, a stack of cash. It's too much to be just allowance. I think he might be stealing." Her words hung in the air like a firework about to explode. Linda Perkins, the local PTA president and a relentless busybody, leaned forward. "Stealing? From where? Stores? Kids at school? I don't know." Diane replied, feigning distress. I hope it's nothing illegal. God knows I try my best as a single mom, but sometimes I think he's following in his father's footsteps." Linda gasped, and that was all it took. By Friday morning, whispers were circulating among parents. By lunchtime, half the school was buzzing with exaggerated versions of Diane's tale. It hit Max like a wrecking ball. "Carson." Principal Higgins' gravelly voice called over the intercom during sixth period. "Please report to the main office immediately." Confused but not particularly alarmed, Max packed his things and headed down the hall. When he stepped into the office, though, the sight of his mother sitting rigidly across from the principal sent an icy jolt down his spine. "What's going on?" Max asked, his voice steady but wary. Principal Higgins folded his hands. "Max, we've received some serious allegations about you involving stolen property and cash transactions on school grounds." "What?" Max's voice cracked. "That's not true." "It's not true." Diane chimed in, a little too forcefully. "Max would never do something like that." Max stared at her, his pulse quickening. There was a strange glint in her eye, not fear, but something closer to pride. Did she think this was some kind of dramatic performance where she was the star? Despite Max's protests, the school decided to investigate. A week later, Principal Higgins called them back to deliver the verdict. After reviewing reports and speaking with several students and parents, we believe there's sufficient evidence to warrant disciplinary action, he said grimly. Max, I'm sorry, but we're recommending expulsion. At home that evening, Max sat in stunned silence as Diane paced the living room, trying to justify the situation. I can't believe this school, she ranted. How dare they treat my son like some common criminal? I told Linda Perkins I didn't think you were capable of stealing, but of course, she twists my words. Max froze. Wait. Linda Perkins? You told Linda Perkins about this? Diane faltered. Well. I might have mentioned, you started this, Max said, his voice barely above a whisper. The realization hit him like a freight train. You told Linda, and she spread it. That's not fair, Max. I was just venting. Venting? Max's voice rose, a rare moment of defiance. You ruined my life because you wanted attention from your stupid friends. Diane's expression hardened. Don't you dare take that tone with me. I'm your mother. Yeah, Max shot back, grabbing his jacket. Lucky me. He walked out the door and didn't look back. The sky over Cleveland was a dull, oppressive gray as Max leaned against the window of his Uncle Eric's beat-up Ford truck. It had been 2 weeks since he left Lincoln, and the numbness that initially enveloped him had given way to a slow-burning anger. The humiliation of his expulsion still sat heavy on his chest, but even worse was the betrayal. His mother, the one person who was supposed to protect him, had become the architect of his downfall. Eric Carson, Diane's younger brother, was the complete opposite of his sister, laid back, practical, and a man of few words. He owned a small auto repair shop on the east side of Cleveland and had offered to take Max in, no questions asked. Place isn't much, but it's quiet, Eric said as they pulled up to a modest 2-story house. You'll have your own room upstairs. Rent-free, but you're pitching in at the shop after school. Deal? Max nodded, grateful for the stability Eric was offering. The transition to a new school was rough. Max wasn't particularly social before, but at least back in Lincoln, he'd had a reputation for being the smart, dependable kid. Here, he was nobody, a transfer student with a past nobody knew or cared to ask about. The only saving grace was that he didn't have to constantly dodge whispers and side eyes like he had in Lincoln. Despite Eric's best efforts to make him feel at home, Max kept to himself, retreating to his room after work and avoiding long conversations. He threw himself into schoolwork and spent weekends helping Eric at the shop. Fixing cars became a therapeutic escape, hands covered in grease, head filled with the comforting hum of tools. It gave him purpose, even if only temporarily. One evening, as they closed up the shop, Eric finally broke the silence. You've been quiet, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Not that I'm complaining, but, something's eating at you. Max hesitated. He hadn't told Eric the full story. All Eric knew was that Max had been expelled and needed a fresh start. It's my mom, Max admitted finally. She's the reason I got kicked out. Eric raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He waited. She made up some stupid story, probably just for attention, and it got out of hand. Everyone at school thought I was some kind of criminal. She won't even admit she did anything wrong. Eric let out a low whistle. That's Diane for you. Always thought she was the smartest person in the room. Guess she hasn't changed. Max looked up, surprised. You're not defending her. Eric snorted. Hell no. I love my sister, but she's always been selfish. She doesn't mean to hurt people, but she does. You're not the first person she's thrown under the bus. Hearing that didn't make Max feel better, but it confirmed what he'd suspected. Diane wasn't going to change. If he wanted his life back, he'd have to rebuild it on his own. Months passed, and slowly, life in Cleveland began to stabilize. Max's grades improved, and his knack for fixing things caught the attention of one of his teachers, Mr. Garrison, who ran the school's robotics club. "You've got a good mind for engineering," Garrison said one afternoon, handing Max a flyer for a statewide robotics competition. "You ever thought about pursuing it? There's scholarship money involved." Max shrugged. "I don't know. College seems far off." "Well, you should think about it. You've got talent, Carson. Don't let it go to waste." The encouragement was unexpected, but it lit a small spark in Max. For the first time since his expulsion, he felt like he could aim for something bigger than just surviving. One night, Diane called. It was the first time Max had heard her voice in nearly 6 months. "Maxie," she said, her tone overly bright. "I just wanted to check in. How are you? How's school?" Max's stomach churned. The nickname, the faux concern, it all felt like an act. "I'm fine," he said curtly. "What do you want?" "Why would you think I want something?" Diane replied, feigning hurt. "Can't a mother check on her son?" Max's grip on the phone tightened. "You didn't check on me when I got expelled. Or when I had to move across the state. So yeah, I'm guessing you want something." There was a long pause before Diane sighed dramatically. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time to come home. This whole situation has been blown out of proportion. People aren't even talking about it anymore." "Of course they're not," Max snapped. "You've probably found some new story to spread about someone else." "Max, I'm not coming back, Mom," he said firmly. "And don't call me again." He hung up before she could respond, his heart pounding. Cutting Diane out of his life was like pulling a splinter, painful but necessary. The robotics competition became Max's new obsession. He stayed late after school, perfecting designs and troubleshooting code. His team didn't win first place, but they placed high enough to catch the attention of a recruiter from a local tech firm. The recruiter mentioned an internship program, which Max eagerly applied for. By the time he graduated, Max had a clear path, a full scholarship to a nearby university, thanks to his internship experience and stellar recommendations. He still thought about Diane sometimes, but only in fleeting moments. He was too busy building a life she'd never have control over again. Max Carson stood on the balcony of his downtown Chicago apartment, sipping coffee as the city stirred awake beneath him. The early morning sun cast golden streaks over glass skyscrapers, and the hum of traffic filtered through the air. It had been more than a decade since he'd left Lincoln, Ohio, a decade filled with relentless work, sacrifice, and a determination to prove that no one, not even his mother, could keep him down. At 28, Max was the CEO of his own tech startup, Carson Analytics, a company that specialized in predictive algorithms for small businesses. The company had just landed its first multi-million-dollar deal with a national retail chain. Success, it turned out, was the best revenge. Max's rise wasn't accidental. After graduating college, he spent years working for a mid-level tech firm in Chicago, scraping together savings and gaining experience. He absorbed everything he could: coding, marketing, leadership. By 25, he'd saved enough to quit his job and pour his energy into Carson Analytics, building the company from his studio apartment. It hadn't been easy. There were months when he couldn't make rent, nights spent coding until sunrise, and plenty of rejection from investors. But each setback only fueled his drive. He thought often about the night he'd walked out of Diane's house, vowing to rebuild his life without her interference. That promise had kept him going. One afternoon, as Max was reviewing projections for an upcoming product launch, his assistant popped her head into his office. "Max, there's a call for you online too." Diane Carson. The name hit him like a cold slap. He hadn't spoken to his mother in years. A quick search online had kept him vaguely aware of her life. She was still in Lincoln, still dabbling in the same book clubs and PTA events, though now with a streak of financial instability. "Tell her I'm in a meeting," Max said, his voice even. His assistant hesitated. She's been calling for a week. Says it's urgent. Max clenched his jaw. He knew Diane well enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't an apology call. She wanted something. Block the number, he said finally, dismissing the matter. But Diane wasn't one to give up easily. A week later, she appeared in person. Max was leaving the office late one evening when he spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench outside the building. Diane. Her once meticulously styled blonde hair was now streaked with gray, and her clothes looked worn, a far cry from the prim, polished woman he remembered. Max, she called, standing and brushing herself off. I didn't know any other way to reach you. Max stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't be here. Diane's smile faltered. I needed to see you. It's been so long. It's been long because I wanted it that way, Max replied coldly. What do you want? Diane's eyes darted to the ground. I'm in trouble, Max, financial trouble. I thought maybe, now that you're doing so well, you could help me out. Max laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You want me to bail you out? After everything? Max, I know I made mistakes, Diane said, her voice trembling. I wasn't perfect, but I'm still your mother. You can't just turn your back on me. I turned my back on you because you turned your back on me first, Max shot back. You destroyed my reputation for fun. You let me get expelled and acted like it was no big deal. You made me feel like I was nothing. And now you want me to help you? Diane's expression hardened. I did what I thought was best for us. You wouldn't understand, you were just a kid. Exactly, Max snapped. I was a kid, and you were supposed to protect me. Not use me as fodder for your little soap opera. Diane stepped closer, her tone turning desperate. I've changed, Max. I swear. Just, give me a loan. I'll pay it back. I'm on the verge of losing my house. Max stared at her for a long moment. Part of him wanted to lash out, to unleash years of pent-up anger. But another part of him, one that had grown stronger over the years, felt nothing but pity. I'm sorry, he said finally. But I can't help you. He walked away without looking back. Diane's reappearance left Max rattled. He'd spent years pushing her out of his mind, focusing on his work, his goals. But now, all the old feelings came rushing back, the betrayal, the anger, the humiliation. He found himself replaying their conversation, her excuses, her audacity. A week later, while scrolling through news updates on his phone, he stumbled upon an article about Lincoln's PTA. A familiar name popped out, Diane Carson, accused of defrauding the group's fundraising committee. Max smirked. She hadn't changed at all. And for the first time, he wondered if it was time to do something about it. Max began digging. It didn't take much to uncover Diane's tangled web of lies and financial misdeeds. She'd been borrowing money from friends, skipping payments on her mortgage, and even conning local businesses with bogus charity fundraisers. Her reputation in Lincoln, once pristine, was starting to crumble. An idea began to form in Max's mind, not just to expose Diane but to orchestrate her downfall in a way that would ensure she could never manipulate anyone again. Max called in a few favors, using his connections to quietly spread word of Diane's schemes. Anonymous tips were sent to local news outlets. Evidence of her fraudulent activities found its way into the hands of her creditors and the PDA. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Diane had spent her entire life hurting others, and it was time for her to face the consequences. It started with a phone call. Max's assistant, Kate, peeked into his office, holding a message slip like it was contaminated. She called again, Kate said with a sympathetic look. She didn't have to say who. Max leaned back in his chair, the tension settling into his shoulders. Block her number, he said for the second time that month. Kate hesitated. She's Been calling from different ones. She left a voicemail this time. Said it's urgent. Let me guess. She's changed, right? Max said bitterly. Kate didn't reply. She simply set the message slip on his desk and left. For a moment, Max stared at the paper. He'd done his best to erase Diane Carson from his life, but her persistence was as relentless as her ability to wreak havoc. After a few moments, curiosity got the better of him. He played the voicemail. Max. It's your mother, Diane's voice began, uncharacteristically soft. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I really need to talk to you. Please. It's important. Just give me 10 minutes. You can call me back or... I'm in Chicago for a couple of days. I'll be staying at the Evergreen Inn on Grand. Please, Max. He deleted the voicemail and threw the message slip in the trash. But the seed was planted. By the next morning, he found himself standing outside the Evergreen Inn, questioning every step that brought him there. The hotel was shabby but clean. Diane was sitting in a small cafe off the lobby, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked older than Max remembered, her once perfect hair was limp, her makeup doing little to hide the exhaustion etched into her face. When she spotted him, her expression lit up. Max, she exclaimed, standing awkwardly as if she wasn't sure whether to hug him. Max didn't make it easy for her, staying rooted in place until she sat back down. You've got 10 minutes, he said flatly, sliding into the chair across from her. Diane looked hurt, but she quickly covered it with a shaky smile. I'm so glad you came. I didn't think you would. Get to the point. She flinched at his tone but nodded. Okay. Look, I need your help. I know I have no right to ask, but I'm in a bad place, Max. A really bad place. What kind of bad place? Max asked, feigning interest. Diane sighed heavily, stirring her coffee even though she hadn't added anything to it. I've been struggling to make ends meet. After your father left, well, you know how hard it's been. And then the PDA. Those people are vultures. They turned on me, Max, over a misunderstanding. They're dragging my name through the mud, and I could lose my house. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked up at him with watery eyes. Max felt nothing. Why don't you ask Linda Perkins, he said coolly. I'm sure she'd love to hear another story. Diane stiffened. Max, this isn't a joke. I'm serious. I don't have anyone else. You don't have anyone else because you burned every bridge you ever crossed, Max said sharply. You lied. You cheated. You used people. And now you're surprised no one wants to help you. I made mistakes, Diane said, her voice rising. But I'm still your mother. Exactly. And because of you, I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch. You didn't just make mistakes, Diane, you ruined me. I'll never forget walking into school and hearing the rumors, seeing the way people looked at me. You took everything from me, and you did it for what? A little sympathy. A little attention. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought you'd moved past all that. Max laughed bitterly. Moved past it? You don't get to decide when I move past it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Diane looked down at her hands, and Max studied her, waiting for the excuse, the defense, the self-pity. But what came next surprised him. You're right, she said quietly. I don't get to decide. I can't take back what I did, Max. But I need you. Please. Her voice cracked again, and for a fleeting moment, Max felt a twinge of something, sympathy. Guilt. But then he remembered all the sleepless nights, the humiliation, the loneliness. He shook his head. I'm sorry, he said, rising from his seat. But I can't help you. Max, wait, Diane's voice broke as she reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I hope you figure it out," he said before walking out of the cafe and into the brisk Chicago air. He didn't look back. The encounter left Max feeling uneasy. He'd expected to feel triumphant, even vindicated, after rejecting Diane. Instead, he felt hollow. The anger that had driven him for so many years had become a part of him, and now, without it, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. But Diane wasn't done. She called again 2 days later, leaving another voicemail. This time, her tone was different, harsher. "You'll regret this, Max," she spat. "I don't care how successful you are now. You're still the same ungrateful little boy who needed me to clean up his messes. Don't think for a second that you're better than me." Max deleted the voicemail without hesitation, but her words lingered. She was right about one thing: he wasn't better than her. Not yet. Max threw himself into work, hoping to drown out the echoes of his encounter with Diane. But something gnawed at him, a restless energy that wouldn't go away. He told himself he didn't care what happened to her, but deep down, he did. Not because he loved her, but because he hated her. And that hatred wasn't going to disappear on its own. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. The buzzing neon lights of downtown Chicago reflected in Max's office windows as he stared out into the city. His mind swirled with fragmented thoughts of Diane, her desperation, her audacity, and her venomous parting voicemail. She hadn't changed. She wasn't going to change. For years, he'd tried to rise above it, to prove that he didn't need to stoop to her level. But her reappearance had reignited something he thought he'd buried, the need to confront her, not just with words, but with actions. If she wanted him to regret turning his back, he'd make sure she regretted far more. Max didn't need much time to gather the information he needed. Diane had a long history of manipulative behavior, but her recent financial troubles had turned her schemes from petty to criminal. She'd borrowed money from friends, faked fundraising efforts for local charities, and even forged documents to delay foreclosure on her house. Her fragile reputation in Lincoln was teetering on the edge of collapse. Max called in a favor from a private investigator he'd used once for a corporate background check. Within days, he had a detailed report on Diane's activities, complete with evidence of fraud, unpaid debts, and even pending lawsuits from former friends and local businesses. "This is extensive," the investigator said over the phone. "What do you want to do with it?" Max tapped a pen against his desk, considering his options. "I want her exposed," he said finally. "Every lie, every scam, make it public." "Anonymous?" the investigator asked. Max hesitated. "For now." The plan unfolded like a symphony, each movement calculated and precise. Max began anonymously leaking key pieces of Diane's misconduct to local media outlets in Lincoln. Small-town newspapers thrived on scandal, and Diane Carson's name quickly became synonymous with deceit. Then came the whispers. Max watched from afar as Diane's social circle shrank overnight. The same women who had once fawned over her at book clubs and luncheons now turned their backs, unwilling to be associated with the growing list of accusations. But Max wasn't done. He orchestrated one final blow. Using his resources, Max arranged for a community event, a charity gala sponsored by Carson Analytics. It was a strategic move. Max's growing success was already attracting attention in Lincoln, and the gala would serve as both a homecoming and a stage for Diane's downfall. The event was hosted in the Lincoln Civic Center, a grand affair with catered food, live music, and local dignitaries in attendance. Diane, ever the opportunist, couldn't resist showing up despite her tarnished reputation. She arrived dressed to the nines, her head held high as if sheer determination could will her past the mounting scandals. Max watched her from across the room, a champagne flute in hand. When their eyes met, she hesitated, then began making her way toward him. "Max," she said with a strained smile. "I didn't think you'd be here." "I'm the host," he replied evenly. Of course I'm here. Diane's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. I'm glad we can finally talk. I've been trying to reach you. Save it, Max interrupted. You've already said everything you needed to. Before Diane could respond, the evening's MC took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. We'd like to take a moment to recognize a special guest, Max Carson, a hometown hero who's brought so much to our community. Let's give him a warm round of applause. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Diane froze, her face a mask of disbelief. Max walked to the stage, his expression calm but his heart pounding. Thank you, he said into the microphone. It's an honor to be here tonight. Lincoln has always been home to me, even when life took me far from here. But tonight, I want to address something important, a lesson I've learned about integrity, accountability, and the consequences of our actions. He paused, letting his words sink in. Diane shifted uncomfortably in the audience, her face pale. I was once told that success is the best revenge, Max continued. But I've realized that true justice comes from the truth. And sometimes, the truth needs a little help being heard. As he stepped off the stage, murmurs filled the room. Moments later, a reporter from the local paper approached Diane, armed with questions about her recent scandals. Max watched from the corner of the room as she tried to deflect, her composure crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. By the following week, Diane's life was in free fall. Her house was officially foreclosed, her remaining friends had abandoned her, and local authorities began investigating her fraudulent activities. Max heard through the grapevine that she'd moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, living off what little savings she had left. He felt no joy in her downfall, but he didn't feel guilt either. She had built her life on lies, and now those lies had come crashing down. One evening, Max's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered out of curiosity. Max? Diane's voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. What do you want? He asked, his tone neutral. I wanted to say I'm sorry, she said quietly. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I'm begging you, please. I have nowhere else to go. Max closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling over him. For a moment, he considered giving her another chance. But then he remembered the years of manipulation, the pain, the betrayal. I'm sorry too, he said finally. But you made your choices, Diane. Now you have to live with them. He hung up, this time for good. Max sat on the edge of his bed in his Chicago penthouse, the city lights sprawling out behind him. His phone lay on the nightstand, Diane's last voicemail still lingering in his mind. She had sounded broken, more defeated than he had ever imagined. For years, he had dreamed of this moment, the ultimate justice for everything she had put him through. Now, with her downfall complete, he should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt empty. The revenge he had pursued with such precision left him questioning what came next. Over the following weeks, Max threw himself into his work, but the satisfaction that usually came with closing deals and leading his team seemed muted. His colleagues noticed the change. You okay, boss? Kate asked one afternoon after a particularly quiet meeting. Just tired, Max replied, though he knew it wasn't the truth. He wasn't tired, he was restless. The culmination of years of resentment had left him with nothing to chase. His mother was out of his life, her empire of lies reduced to rubble. But the closure he had sought eluded him. Late one night, Max revisited the private investigator's report on Diane. Among the pages of financial misconduct and personal failures was a detail he hadn't given much thought before. Diane's father, Max's grandfather, had abandoned her family when she was a teenager. Max stared at the line, his thoughts drifting to the cycles of dysfunction that seemed to define their family. He'd spent his life blaming Diane for everything, and rightly so, but now, for the first time, he wondered, had she ever truly known how to be better? Weeks passed, and the holidays approached. Max had planned to spend Christmas alone, as he had every year since moving to Chicago. But the nagging thought of Diane in her lonely motel room refused to leave his mind. On Christmas Eve, he found himself dialing a number he had sworn never to call again. She answered on the second ring. "Hello." Her voice was tentative, as though she didn't believe anyone would actually call. "It's me," Max said. There was a long pause. "Max." Her voice cracked. "Why are you calling?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we need to talk." They agreed to meet at a diner halfway between Chicago and Lincoln, a nondescript place with formica tables and peeling wallpaper. When Diane walked in, she looked even more worn than the last time he had seen her. Her once bright eyes were dulled, and the lines around her mouth had deepened. Max stood awkwardly as she approached the booth. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. He didn't respond right away, studying her face instead. For the first time, she seemed smaller to him, not the imposing, manipulative force that had loomed over his childhood, but a frail woman who had lost everything. "I don't know why I came," Max admitted after a moment. "Maybe I just wanted to see if you changed." Diane lowered her gaze. "I have," she said quietly. "Losing everything has a way of doing that to you. I know you won't believe me, but I am sorry, Max. For all of it." Max leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Sorry doesn't undo what you did." "I know," she said quickly. "I know it doesn't. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I wanted to tell you that I've been trying to be better. I've started going to therapy. It's hard. But it's helping me understand things." Max raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Diane hesitated, then sighed. "Like how I pushed people away. How I used you, and everyone else. I always thought I was doing what I had to do to survive, but maybe I was just too selfish to see the damage I was causing." Her words caught Max off guard. Diane had always been a master manipulator, but this didn't feel like an act. For the first time, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Max said honestly. "But I can't keep carrying this hate around, either. It's exhausting." Diane nodded, her eyes glistening. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm trying. And I'm proud of you, Max. I know I never said it before, but I am." Max stared at her, the anger he had carried for years mingling with a newfound sense of pity. He didn't trust her, but he also didn't want to spend the rest of his life haunted by her. "I'll make you a deal," he said finally. "I'll help you get back on your feet, enough for you to get out of that motel and start fresh somewhere. But it comes with conditions." Diane nodded eagerly. "Anything. You pay back every cent you owe to the people you've hurt," Max said firmly. "And you stay in therapy. If you backslide, the deal's off. I'm not here to save you, Diane. This is your last chance." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Max." Months later, Max watched from afar as Diane slowly began to rebuild her life. She took a job at a community center in a neighboring town and began making amends with some of the people she had wronged. Max didn't maintain regular contact, but he kept tabs on her progress. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Helping her wasn't about redemption for Diane, it was about freeing himself from the grip of her shadow. He'd proven to himself that he could rise above her toxicity, and now, he was finally letting go. On a quiet evening, as the sun set over Chicago, Max stood on his balcony and raised a glass to the skyline. His life was his own now, and for the first time, he felt ready to truly live it.